Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to continue, obviously, the big overarching theme is around resilience. And first of all, great to see everyone here is very resilient. We're here back after lunch for the next session. And we've talked already this morning about the sort of particularly a lot of the pupil perspective and then the teacher perspective, the school perspective. So now we're kind of elevating a little bit further and thinking about the systems level and how robust systems are, how they're responding to the big challenges we've been talking about, including the sort of the 4 Cs that Alicia was mentioning this morning around COVID and conservatism, climate, and so on. And so I'd like to sort of, first of all, go across our panel and hear a little bit first your perspective on really, you know, almost definitionally, what are you seeing as the big pressures at the system level in education around resilience? And then we'll come back round and talk a little bit more on some solutions and challenges going forward. And a reminder also over the next hour, do please use the app and post your questions, and we'll certainly have a good substantive discussion drawing on your questions from the audience in the latter half of this hour. But let's talk first then a little bit about the big challenges to the system. We'll start here.
Okay. So thank you very much to Yidan for this very important, of course, meeting, and to the rest of the panelists. Well, in the case of Latin America, and I think when one thinks in terms of creating a resilient system, we have to think in terms of the capacity to predict, the capacity to understand, and the capacity to react and to adapt to the new conditions. And for that, of course, we need data, and we need some capacity to react in terms of system-based issues. Now, what are the pressures that we see? First of all, we see a pressure in terms of economic development. If we compare the last decade to the previous one, we have grown a tenth of what we had grown in the previous decade. So we have heard about the lost decade in economic development in Latin America in the 80s, but actually this has been even worse. And what does it mean for education? It means basically less fiscal space, less fiscal capacity to expand expenditure in countries in which we know that the expenditure is still quite low in terms of per pupil expenditure per year. So one pressure has to do with the pressure to lower even expenditure, even more after COVID and because of this lower economic growth. The second pressure, of course, has to come with in regards to polarization. If we see Latin America, we've gone down the last 8 years, consecutive years, in all types of scores on the Economist Democracy Index. And that polarization, again, creates a pressure to the system in terms of, again, reducing budgets, in terms of non-sustainable policies for the future. It doesn't allow us to really come together and think in terms of collective solutions to, future-proof our systems because we're too polarized. And of course, there are specific issues in Latin America regarding to one of our main characteristics as societies. We're not the poorest, but we're the most unequal society in the world, sometimes competing with sub-Saharan Africa. And that means basically, again, a quite fractured system that does not allow us to really collectively face these challenges that have to do with, and now let's go to some of the big problems, migration. After, of course, the Middle East, we have the second most important migration processes going on from Venezuela, more than 7 million people fleeing out of Venezuela, but also we have migration from Haiti, which is quite important, and of course the corridor through Central America towards the US. So it's the migratory processes are very, very important in Latin America. Second, the issue of climate change and earthquakes. It's a very active, geological active region. And finally, something that is more maybe invisible, and we don't tend to talk about this, is drug trafficking and violence. It is actually something that we haven't proven, we haven't protected our systems that are becoming irrelevant for the new generations. They have to opt between being in a gang and earning lots of money in the short term, or going through school, which sometimes is too pertinent for their own reality. So we have many pressures, but I will just want to leave the idea of the importance of thinking of resilience, not so much from the agency perspective, of course, of actors, key in terms of students and teachers, but mostly in terms of systems. How do we future-proof our systems in terms of funding, governance, in terms of teacher support? And when we will go into that probably at some point, when we see those systems are more resilient, are those who are able to really support our teachers on the ground. So I think those are the main issues.
We'll come back to that.
Thank you.
But Becky, I mean, that was a very comprehensive list of pressures, and ones that, of course, we see, don't we, with your work at UNHCR, huge numbers of people displaced compared to the past. What would you add to, or kind of emphasize perhaps in some of those pressures that you're observing in networks, education systems around the world?
Yeah, I think I would add scale to what you've said. I mean, the number of crises is growing and continues to grow, and I think we see it every day at the moment on the news. But the number of refugees has almost doubled in the last 5 years. And 75% of them are still hosted in lower and lower middle income countries. So not just the scale, but the pressures that it puts on already fragile systems, I think, has been a huge challenge. When we think about systems resilience, it's not just looking at, a school level or even kind of national level, but it's what are the things that can happen externally and across borders to think about, how to make resilience so that it can be in place when the next thing happens. When we think about coping, and very often a country or a system can cope with a crisis. But what we're seeing is, cyclical shocks and displacement being exacerbated and, leading to climate issues, to conflict, to destruction of schools, to massive issues with economic development, and then limited resources in responding. And so I think the scale, the frequency, and the pace is what makes it so hard to remain resilient when so many things keep happening at once.
And Sultan, of course, you're closer to what we're seeing at the moment, very uncertain changes taking place in the Middle East. What are you seeing in terms of the real big tension points around resilience systems?
Obviously within the Middle East, the biggest challenge is conflict. And at the moment, if you look at the map all the way from Morocco all the way to the Gulf, we are engulfed in conflict of all sorts. And this has been the case ever since the end of the Cold War. And I think at the heart of all this has been the creation of the State of Israel. And it's something that in the Middle East we have to address. Ever since that creation, the energy, including the investment, has been diverted towards confronting Israel and dealing with the consequences of that entity being created in the middle of the region. But of course, based on that, we have had all sorts of governance systems that have resulted in other form of conflict, a fallout of this existence. And it has really gave priority to security and to intelligence and to arming people and to employing people into armies rather than investing in their proper education. And we have this irony that on the one hand, we have a very good attainment record and grades in terms of school education, but the transition from school to higher education to employment is problematic. So the next challenge, I think, is economic, and it has to do a lot with the employment of young people. We have a huge unemployment phenomena in the Middle East that is threatening whatever little progress made here and there, and threatening, I think, the possibility of peace and stability in the whole region. And to add to that, I think the two phenomena are connected now to the climate change phenomena, which is putting a lot of communities under pressure, and again is actually producing conflict between urban and rural areas, between tribal and settled communities across the Middle East. Now, the combination of the three, I think, is giving the very unstable nature of society at the moment. What does education, or what can education do? It's a big question, and probably we have a lot of expectations from it. But I'll start with the two, if you allow me, 2 points that are minimum. One is to focus on the family, because our culture, our religion, the way things are structured, between the individual and the system, we have a very important link, and that is the family. And we need to understand better how the family can build the resilience of the individual and also contribute to the resilience of the system, and vice versa. And this is something that is easy to say, but it's quite difficult when you're confronted with universal systems that really are driven, I must say, by Western thought that gives priority to the individual as opposed to the family. And the second, I think, to focus on contextualization and what is it we're actually teaching the students. We still insist on rolling out universal curriculum that all it does in many parts is encouraging people to migrate into cities. We need to go back to where people live and adapt our education so that they can be resilient within their context, whether they're living in the desert, they're living on the mountaintops, by the riversides, and so on. And what can we do so that they can make the best out of their potential within those contexts? And of course, there will be those who aspire to go to the city. But at the moment, it's a mass migration. It's just a one-way route, which adds up to the unemployment problem and the critical urbanization in many of our cities, and makes it almost impossible then to cater in terms of higher education and the transition to jobs. So this is, I think, another important thing we have to address. And when it comes to the universal system, I think we need to be more consistent in terms of our values. And when we take a decision, we need to stick by it. When we are advocating for values, we need to stand by those values and uphold them, so that what happened over the last year and 2 months in Gaza is not repeated. And I think this is, we still haven't seen the impact of this yet, but I'm sure it will come. The anger about the double standards, the inability of the international community to stand up behind those messages has been absolutely great, including, unfortunately, our educational ecosystem and you know, the silence of UNESCO, for example, at the beginning of the war has left a lot of bitter taste among those of us who have fought hard to protect education in times of war.
Yeah, maybe jumping a little bit around, we were thinking around the role of different stakeholders in this whole process to build resilience at the systems level. And Sultan mentioned families. And Becky, I don't know what your thought is on that. I mean, I remember talking to Pratham in India, and they were saying one of the real lessons from the pandemic was suddenly there was less of a black box around the school, and families and communities did start to become much more involved in supporting their children's education. I don't know whether that resonates with you, sort of ongoing, as it were, as a slightly missing piece that perhaps we need to engage with more.
Yes, I think, you know, very often we don't talk about parents and caregivers in these conversations. There's been very, very rightly a huge focus on, you know, engaging children and young people and on teachers, but sometimes parents and caregivers are part of that missing link. But it's also recognizing that, you know, systems are made up of the people in them. Sometimes we talk about a system as though it's this kind of incredible spaceship that just exists and, you know, stops us doing our great work. I think, you know, it's important to recognize systems are kind of slow to turn in a way that individuals aren't, right? But you have a lot of agility and a lot of care that comes from communities. And I think one of the things that you see with refugees and other, you know, families impacted by conflict is that very often they are providing education for their children. They are seeking out education for their children. People are not, you know, sitting on their hands waiting to be given something. And that has been the case, you know, forever. I think where the systems piece comes in is then saying that can be very unequal. So the people who can do, but what about the people who can't? So how do you put the system in place to make sure that there is some equity, there is some protection, and also to as we talked about, to set some standards, to have something which is, more uniform and then more applicable. And that, that is absolutely able to be contextualized, to respond to, cultural norms, to bring in all of those positives and work for everybody. But I do think it's interesting where, one of the challenges for refugees in particular is obviously they're not in their own country. So when you're thinking about systems and you're thinking about norms, who sets those and whose responsibility is it? We have a very strong focus on inclusion in national systems. And that means also, are refugees able to join a parent-teacher association? Are they able to be part of the teachers' union, if they're teaching? So it's really trying to make sure that people have that voice, but so it's also not just that you have a voice, but there's someone listening. How do you streamline some of those processes so that the system is improved for everybody?
And some of the systems you're dealing with, as you say, yes, obviously, so you're liaising, or you need to liaise with the government, the local government, as it were. What about even other international agencies and so on? You're just thinking about the kind of, obviously in a refugee situation, you often have multiple agencies, don't you, sort of divvying up or maybe leaving some holes in coverage? Any thoughts on some of those other key stakeholders in a refugee system that we need to think about more?
Yes, I mean, there's lots of UN agencies involved, and that's from the, the global protection space. But I think it's really important to recognise the leadership and the ownership of national governments. I mean, you are a refugee in a country that is a sovereign country that makes decisions. And I think we really recognise the generosity of hosting governments, who have looked after people on their land for such a long time. Having them much more in the lead of those processes just makes more sense. And I think that's also about sustainability, and it's about making those systems resilient. I think if you look at somewhere like Chad, there's lots of international agencies involved, but it's been the government of Chad who have led comprehensively a response to look at including refugees into the national system. That's taken 12 years to get to where it is, and that has been a big push on recruiting teachers, training teachers, making sure that the curriculum works both for refugees and host, lining up the finance and having the quality assurance. But because of all of that work previously, when another 600,000 Sudanese refugees entered Chad, it was able to just about cope. And that's in one of the poorest countries in the world, which is incredibly fragile. But that continued commitment, absolutely, the international community is there, and we do everything we can to support the government, but government leadership is really critical.
And I'm going to ask all of you in a minute about some bright spots of interesting models in different places, but Javier, just to wrap up on the stakeholder question, including the role of families and others, any other thoughts you see in the region about groups that perhaps are neglected or that it's really important to engage with?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, internally, I would say teacher and teacher unions. I was just talking about this today in the morning. We usually see teacher unions as actors that tend to bargain salaries and that kind of thing, but are sometimes not prepared or are not invited really to think about solutions regarding the system. And how we incorporate such an important actor is, I think, a challenge for our region. The second part on my answer would be in the international cooperation, and how, of course, we need to create a lot of public goods, and we need to promote cooperation. But in order to do that, we need definitely better governance systems, and governance that are not really driven by international organizations, but systems that allow priorities to come really from the countries. And we've experienced such a system, and maybe I want to comment on a hub actually that we lead in Latin America, which is a KICS hub. It's an initiative for the Global Partnership for Education. KICS stands for Knowledge Innovation Exchange. So it is a system in which we have actually 10 countries in which each country has their own representatives from the teacher union, from the ministry, from NGOs and academics. And we openly establish priorities for those countries in terms of research and actionable projects. So it is a system that is not being led from Washington or from London or from Paris, in which you're saying, well, here's the money, but you have to use it in what I think it must be used. It is a system in which the priorities really come from the countries. and then they're channeled and through the research and the project. So the point of really creating bottom-up governance systems that are effective to tackle these challenges, I think it's an important issue.
So let's talk about some other bright spots, perhaps interesting examples or models. Sultan, maybe first. Where might you point to where there's some good models that are being put in place, perhaps, to support the question of resilience?
Well, good models. I think the way Jordan coped with many waves of refugees was a good model, but it took them a long time to convince the international community of the necessity of integrating the refugees into the national education system. And this brings us into this ongoing discussion always between the donors and the recipient countries as to whose agenda is more important and how do you really reach a balance where you put the benefit and the interest of the children and education at the center rather than your own domestic politics back in parliament or Congress and so on, and or the host country only. And this requires serious humanitarian diplomacy efforts, and it has got to be as early as possible. I think it's totally unacceptable that people are stuck in 10 years, 3 or sometimes 15 years in refugee camps before we sort out a system that is sustainable for education. So Jordan, I think, did reasonably well, both dealing with the Iraqis first and then the Syrians. And that was largely based on the way they've dealt with the Palestinians before that. And because there is a level of trust between them and the donor countries that the money that is directed to the state is largely invested where it is intended to be. Now, I think that lack of trust between the donors and other countries makes it very, very difficult to come up with sustainable systems. So we end up doing token interventions. Some can be technologically high, advanced, etc. But really, we all know that they're not going to benefit the numbers required in terms of students, bringing them back into school. We know that they're not going to be of quality. And we also know, which is very dramatic really, is that they're not allowing the schools to be a space of protection for children. A protection against natural phenomena, and also protection against armed groups and so on. So we really have as a system to overcome this lack of trust and try to work around the political barriers. And from where I am and what I'm working on at the moment, I think Afghanistan and the Taliban maybe provides an opportunity to do that. That we need to break away from our black and white view of the world, that now we are not doing development in Afghanistan, we're only doing humanitarian assistance. So anything that has to do with the capacity building is not accepted for the donors. And try and understand what is it that they fear about education. What is it that they're trying to protect their women and girls from, and then work somewhere in between. And we have been, there's a lot of dialogue ongoing in this area. But it does really emphasize the need for education system to be active in humanitarian diplomacy. We cannot wait until the crisis is too advanced and only act as per the guidance of the humanitarian coordinators. It's something that exists before the crisis. It will have to adapt. It has to show some resilience during, and hopefully will emerge and recover after the crisis.
I'd just say a little bit more on Afghanistan, where you see there is some scope for movement, because as we know, of course, it's at least the public statements are not terribly good, particularly for girls' education. You see some glimmers of hope there or progress?
Yes, well, I have to say, I mean, I act as a mediator in the context, and I meet frequently with the Taliban leaders, and I would say 95% of the leaders disagree with the decision to prevent girls' education. And the reason is very simple. If you open the Quran, chapter number 1 of the Quran starts by saying, read. And it doesn't say, you man read. It says, men and women read. Because you cannot worship if you cannot read. So they understand this philosophically. But somewhere in the leadership, there is this fear of what they see as Western invasion through whatever curriculum, advances, etc., that they want to take their time, and so on. Where I think we could do more is to release some developmental funding to education so that the areas where there has been exceptions, and there are a lot of exceptions in Afghanistan to the rule, the Taliban broadly turn a blind eye. There's no enforcement of the rule in many ways. But they are not benefiting from the resources from outside to actually build schools for girls or to fund teachers. I mean, we keep arguing about teachers for girls, but it's in 100 years that there will be teachers in some of these rural areas where a lady teacher is willing to live in these remote areas and will be well paid and developed in terms of skills to be able to deliver quality education. So I think now is the time to engage more and more in this diplomacy with them, and part of it would be to support developmental initiatives where exceptions have been accepted and done, so that maybe some of these islands can grow and connect into bigger picture.
Sure. And Becky, you talked briefly about Chad. Other examples where you think there is perhaps some interesting progress or examples that we could learn from?
Yes, I think there's a few. I think what's interesting, though, is first of all that it does take a long time. And, you know, there's a country like Kenya, for example, has made amazing strides. It's been hosting refugees for a very long time. You know, UNHCR has been managing schools in Kenya for 30 years. But there has been a huge push from the Kenyan government to allow the use of the curriculum, to have some national teachers in, to have refugees able to sit exams and be accredited. There are still issues around, you know, freedom of movement and the right to work. But now they've put together what's called the Sharika Plan, which really looks at saying, okay, all the things that we were trying to prevent from having refugees, you know, moving around the country, they're not making sense because we're not using the presence of refugees, the money that comes in from them, and the human capital that those refugees bring with them as part of our broader national development. So Sharika Plan is it's a very comprehensive plan that looks at economic growth, particularly in those areas where refugees are hosted, which have traditionally been, you know, more vulnerable than other places in Kenya. But then actually really gets into the detail of then what would this take? What is the governance at school level, at community level, you know, subnational level, and then within the national government. So I think that's very promising. I think where it kind of takes us to is the cyclical nature of responsibility sharing, right? And I think refugee issues are particularly challenging because they are a global responsibility. There are refugees more in some places than in others, and there are huge expectations on host governments to kind of foot the bill. I think the Global Compact on Refugees is very clear about responsibility sharing, but responsibility sharing is something that we need to get much more creative on. And I think where we were talking about system resilience this morning, you know, thinking about what does it mean to use the different tools we have in our toolkit, right? What does it mean to look at financing, at guarantees, at debt restructuring, debt swaps, all of these kind of innovative pieces, but making sure that we're able to also apply those to some of these very vulnerable groups, including those for whom contribution to the public purse through the ability to work, to earn money, and to be in a country where the tax and public financial management system, you know, is adequate to kind of keep that synergy going. What do we do temporarily to make sure that they're also very much engaged?
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, we talked earlier about economic shocks, but of course, at the moment, particularly in Africa, the level of debt service is just extraordinary, isn't it? And inflation as well, sort of way more than often national education budgets are able to support. But Javier, what other sort of models might you point to in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you. I would start my answer by saying if we think in terms of resilience, we will have to think in terms of, first, our ability to understand and to predict what's happening. And second, the capacity to react and adapt. So let me go first to the first one on understanding and maybe put some examples that we have been promoting from SUMMA at the regional level, which is kind of different from what has been committed more at national level. We promoted, first of all, a GEM report on inclusion, that for the first time we were able to collect information across countries on very invisibilized populations, such as those imprisoned youth, LGBTI population, ethnic minorities, etc., and reach numbers that allow us to react, such as, for example, that 30% of children, of youth, that are imprisoned and therefore basically under the custody of the state do not receive education while they're imprisoned. So they're being deprived of their liberty, but also deprived of their education. And again, we cannot be resilient if we don't know about that. We know that LGBTI population in Latin America, 66% around, so 2/3 of LGBTI children are bullied in their schools. When we ask them who are bullying them, they say mostly teachers are the ones who bully the students. So again, how can we be resilient towards that reality if we don't know about what's happening? So the first thing is about data. And so that's on invisibilized populations, for example. But also we've done more cross-sectional and larger scale surveys, such as the one we did during COVID. We did the largest ever done survey in Latin America in education. 21 countries participated, 200,000 teachers were surveyed during the COVID. While governments were saying that everything was under control, that all teachers and students had their computers and internet, etc., we went directly to teachers, 200,000 teachers, and asked them what was happening during COVID. And we were able to really bring those numbers up. Now, the good thing is that those numbers were actually in data sets were used by governments to then use to design their responses to COVID. So in a region in which we have the longest school closures in the world, we had the longest school closures in the world, this is a very important part of understanding what's happening. So one thing, again, I think a good practice has to do with how do we promote internationally these cross-country surveys, etc., that allow us to compare, learn among each other, etc., before we react. And then I go to the second part, therefore, which is resilience has to do with understanding and being able to predict, but also being able to react and adapt. And in that case, I think, of course, resources are key, and regulatory frameworks are key. And I just want to put an example in terms of earthquakes. In 2010, Chile had one of the biggest earthquakes recorded. It's 8.8 in the scale. Haiti, the same year and the same month, had 7.0. 8.8 versus, it's not linear, right? It's exponential. In Chile, only 500 people died. In Haiti, 330,000 people died. Of course, the comparison is not very fair. Why? Because of resources, but especially, and this is very important, especially because of regulatory framework. In Chile, because of we had the largest ever registered earthquake in 1962, almost 10 in the scale, and therefore we changed all the construction requirements, and therefore today we have different types of requirements. Which in Haiti, despite of resources, they don't even have that regulatory issues. So let me go to education again. We need better regulatory frameworks to look at these different shocks, migration, earthquakes, gang violence, etc. But we also need resources. And let me put one example in which I was involved in the design of a program, which is a voucher which provides more resources for those schools that that serve the poorest children in society. So it has a benefit more than, yearly, it benefits more than 3 million children. And basically what it does is it provides, again, more resources for those schools that are serving the poorest, but they have to use it, and this is the catch part, they have to use it on pedagogical support. They cannot use it in infrastructure, they cannot use it on salaries, they can only use it on pedagogical support. What does that mean is that we have, in this case, this in Chile, we have provided the system a capacity to incorporate shocks, such as earthquake, etc., because of these funds. What we have is the capacity of teachers of being supported, for example. If there's more violence, then you can be pedagogically supported in terms of social emotional skills. If there's an issue regarding academic performance, you can hire technical support for academic and pedagogical support. we have done RCTs with that, and it does make a difference, a huge difference. So my point is, we have to better design our funding systems. They usually are quite flat. They don't distinguish among different students, and really incorporate the cost and the potential cost of bringing those children on board. Not in terms of equity, that means closing gaps, but really in terms of inclusion, which means basically not only acknowledging and valuing our differences, but really being able to construct upon them, upon diversity. So I think that's the real edge on how to bring resilience into the funding system and regulatory systems.
And you talked there about this big study in Latin America around COVID and its impacts. I don't know, Becky and Sultan, whether there are other interesting active research projects that you've been tracking that provide some insights, or indeed gaps where we need more research in the field.
Well, we're involved in trying to look into rebuilding of higher education and how we should give more importance to higher education, both in terms of funding and research, as an engine for recovery in the aftermath of conflict, not just in terms of employment, but also in terms of generating ideas, building social cohesion between different groups. Often the university is the space where different ethnicities, backgrounds, religions, and so on meet. And that is something that is very dear to me, and we're working on it. And now in particular, we're working within the context of Gaza. How do you recover a system that has been, it wasn't accidentally damaged, it was targeted one university after the other by the Israelis until they've destroyed the whole system. And one of the silver linings of COVID is that when COVID hit, they've lifted all the systems into the cloud. And now, although the infrastructure is devastated, the information infrastructure is still there. And that has made it slightly easier to recover and reconnect. And I think now there are about 10,000 Palestinian students from within Gaza that are following their education elsewhere remotely. But of course, much more needs to be done in that area.
Becky, your thoughts, research?
Yes, I mean, I think there's obviously huge research gaps right across the piece. I think one thing that we've been looking at is to encourage and to work on research around refugees, but as part of the system. So very often there's kind of siloed research about, you know, what special things do refugees need? And sometimes that's absolutely the right question, but how can we support a system to have refugees in it? And what is it that governments and communities want to know? So one area that we've been looking at is around cost. Cost is very often where we get stuck collectively on things, especially when it's about sharing responsibility. So really trying to estimate, you know, what is the cost of including refugees into the system, but then also doing some modelling around, you know, what is it, are there gaps, you know, for countries? Do they have limited numbers of teachers or healthcare workers, for example? And then what are the skills that refugees have, and what would it take to have them be able to be employed? So there's lots of different pieces coming, but I think making sure that refugees and other vulnerable groups are really considered as part and parcel of the education landscape, including research, I think is incredibly important.
So I'm going to open it up in a minute to questions. Maybe just a final reflection, which sort of links to research, but and management or tracking of resilience, but sort of metrics. What data might we need? What indicators would be useful or already being tested out that give some sort of a sense of how to prioritize and develop more resilient systems?
Yeah, I think in terms of, well, we would have to think in terms of outputs, if you want. Of course, academic performance, of course, well-being and social, emotional skills, and equity and inclusion. I think those four are key dimensions that we have to look at. But again, in terms of, let's say, indicators to how well prepared we are, I think, again, our capacity to understand, that means our capacity in terms of research, in terms of data collection, and transparency of the data that we have. I think that's very important because, of course, sometimes some governments or states are not totally interested in being transparent in terms of what are the problems that are occurring really in their educational systems. So we have to, that's the first step. And the second, in terms of capacity of the system, as I was saying, in regulatory system, some indicator in terms of do we have or do not have, for example, emergency funds? Do we have or not have funds that are flexible to be used on vulnerable populations? So in terms of capacity, but also in terms of the capacity of teachers and the support that we provide teachers. Again, there are some metrics that we could think of, and let me just put a couple. In most of the research that we've done in Latin America, and this is a key factor, is again, how many visits a year do you receive as a teacher from the state, let's say the municipality or whatever, your local educational authority, in terms of pedagogical support. That means basically observation. Someone that goes and observes your classroom and provides some feedback to the teacher. Usually in Latin America, we move between 2 and 4 a year. So each teacher would receive between 2 to maximum 4 visits in his own class or her own classroom a year. Those systems that work, and let me put an example, is Brazil. Ceará is one of the case studies that many of you might have heard, a very poor, one of the poorest states in Brazil. They have done really incredible work in bringing literacy rates up to almost 100%, with only investing $1,300 per year per student. The OECD does around 12,000, so it's a tenth of what the OECD is investing, and they have very good results. One of the key issues, I was just sharing that in a conversation, is that they visit their teachers once a week. So you have around 48 or 50 visits against 2 or 4. So that means that's an indicator of how much support, real support. Of course, you will have to control by quality, etc. But those are really key indicators of how robust is a system to support teachers when any shock or changes of conditions occur.
Becky, any other metrics you'd add in?
Yes, I mean, I think, like you said, a lot of those things are really critical. I think it's also, we're in a learning crisis already, right? So how do we compare and contrast where we're at the moment with the result of, either resilience measures or kind of looking at additional shocks? But I think having some of the modeling, looking at preparedness, trying to understand what is the information that we need to come in and how do we plan for it, will be really important. But I think generally there's a question on, how well are we as a world doing for the most vulnerable people? And there's a lot of different metrics around that, but I think we continue to see, numbers of displaced people growing, the amount of time in displacement growing, the opportunities available to people, reducing, and keeping some of that in mind, as well as the kind of granular education systems pieces will be really important.
Sultan, any thoughts? Any other metrics?
Well, I think, if I'm allowed, I'll build on Ms. Herbert's C's. I think consistency is very important in the way we respond, and we need to avoid tokenism. Quite often we do token projects in some of those countries that please our audience back home, but it doesn't really create a great impact on the ground. And we should really emphasize more and more on ethics and values. And I was very happy that this has come up in the previous panel. Principles are very important in education, because this is what we want our children to believe in, and we have to be consistent throughout. And then I think I've mentioned the contextualization is really key. We have to stop. This is not the same as having a packaged sandwich or a meal from one country to the other. We need to be able to tailor-make our education programs, not just to fit the political circumstances, but also the environmental circumstances where people live, to allow children to build genuine resilience. And by this, I think we need to avoid using resilience as a concept to run away from responsibility, because this is also something that you find often in the field, that in the name of resilience, we say, well, they will do it on their own, then we can direct our funding elsewhere. And the last, I think, is maybe collaboration and cooperation. I mean, it's come out already many times. We need to find better ways of communicating with each other at the personal level. I appreciate very much all the technological advancement and the fact that we are all networked and so on. But the trauma we deal with, particularly after conflict, there is no substitute to human contact. Some of these people have lost faith in humanity. They've lost faith in a lot of what we stand for. They really need people standing next to them in solidarity, working with them day in, day out, to help them recover some of that ability to become resilient.
Okay, so we've got time for a few questions. Interesting one here. So first, billions of dollars are invested in education by private equity players from kindergarten to university. And you might actually add, of course, not just private equity, but we've got all sorts of blended finance, impact investors, structures, including Education's Outcome Fund and so on. Is private capital a plus or a minus for resilience? Javier? Or did anyone?
Yeah, I think any capital can be, of course, useful and important in education, especially in countries in which expenditure is so low. And when I say that in terms of only percentage of GDP, but especially in terms of real expenditure per year, which is, I think, the important measure. That said, I think it's very important to, of course, for those resources to be, well, channeled through governmental and public policies. So the problem that we have sometimes is that this private resource, resources coming from the private sector, they have their own, let's say, their own goals and tend to be focused towards elite, in the case of Latin America, elite populations. That what they do is that create a system in which most of the middle and upper class will start opting out of the public system. And that creates a problem in terms of taxation, because basically there won't be a lot of support for increasing taxation and therefore fiscal capacity for the rest of the system. So it can be both beneficial if we're able to channel those resources towards the common good, if you want, for good causes, if you want. But they can also be quite disruptive if they're used to just, segregate, fragmentate the system and trying to get, sometimes, private education does that a lot. It basically divides the system and therefore it weakens the whole.
Fragmentation and contradictory objectives to some degree as well. Right? Yeah, Sultan, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think every resource is needed. I mean, the challenges, the scale of it is enormous. And there is a space, obviously, for private capital. But we have to keep in mind that private capital, at the end, the objective is profit. There are new models, non-for-profit, private capital, partnering with state and so on, which is good, and it worked in some Western countries for many, many decades. We need to introduce that into the developing world in the South. We should also, I think, build on other charitable and religious capital. In the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, we've had a trauma with the madrasa concept, which is religiously financed and or community-based finance, largely because we somehow tied it to the idea of terrorism. And I think there's been a lot of studies disengaging the two and making sure that we do not throw the whole thing out of the window. We should be able to work in a much more sophisticated way to understand how those communities cater for the educational needs of their own children in the absence of international help and or in the absence of help from the state. Many states, they don't lack money, but they make priorities in which education does not come on top. And as it started in our part of the world, the majority of the finances in intelligence and in military and police and so on. So we need to make that shift at some stage. And also in Islam, we have a very important source of income or potential education support from zakat money. That is a duty on every Muslim, which I think needs to be captured in a much more systematic way and driven towards education. And again, it goes back to the dialogue. If we don't have that dialogue with those institutions, then we're unlikely to make much progress.
Becky, can private capital help or hinder?
No, I agree. I mean, I think it comes down to equity and protection, and kind of looking at where are the resources coming from, what are the vested interests, and just understanding them. I mean, there's obviously huge engagement from the private sector in education anyway, because it's not just the next set of consumers, but the next set of staff and workforce. And that can be very positive, and kind of, preparing the future-proofing of children and the future-proofing of education means understanding what is happening and what is going to be available, but it's making sure that that's done in a really systematic way that is still very much under kind of the control of the system, because there is more at stake if we get it wrong.
Maybe coming to you again on the second question first. How can we ensure marginalized and vulnerable groups, refugees, those with special needs or without access to technology, are not left behind when building resilient education systems?
Yes, I mean, I think if you build a system that works for the most vulnerable children, it will work for everybody. So it's maybe thinking about it from that perspective. Sometimes it's really looking at the particularities of additional needs. So whether that is if you're a refugee, maybe you need language support, mental health and psychosocial support. You might need recognition of prior qualification. There's specific things that can be done, and I think we've learned a lot from work that has been done to increase girls' access to education, really understanding both their concerns, their parents' concerns around safety to and from school, menstrual health, hygiene management, all of the different pieces. So we're getting much better at understanding what are the specific needs and looking at how they come together, at a school level. I think collectively there's a lot more that we need to do for children with disabilities. Including neurodivergency and other areas. And I think absolutely kind of creating schools where we can hear every child's voice, as we were talking about this morning, is really important. But really not every child is necessarily going to be in a position to raise their voice unless they have significant additional support.
Sultan?
I think we need, again, to do more in terms of integrating education with other very important aspects of development, including public health and environmental protection. And this means that we maybe need to revisit the role of the school, and in particular within the school, the role of the teacher. The teacher these days, because of economic pressures, because of what we heard earlier this morning about, many countries, they don't have the salaries and so on, there is a need to think of a different way, model, if you like, for their work, which can contribute to other areas of development where some resources exist. And public health is one of those areas which is relatively generously funded because we're all afraid of the next pandemic. We don't want it to spread to our own children, so we want to tackle that. We need to think maybe a little bit of a different model. And also when it comes to protection, I think the school it makes a great central point of a community that has to be invested in properly so that the buildings are built to protect the children who spend there 8 hours a day, but also can be used for other community engagements and administration and so on. That model is still fragmented in terms of development. You see agencies working in silos. One agency does the health system in one part of the village, and then somebody else does the school further apart, and then the administration and so on. It's time that we move in a much more integrated fashion, and really education has got to be at the center of this, and more so the teachers, so that they are encouraged to work in these isolated areas and able to flourish and develop their skills.
Yeah. I would say that although I'm a quite, of course, supporter, and I guess we all share the great expectation for technology and artificial intelligence, I think it can also be quite misleading to put too much weight on that. We know that also from the past. And I think to really create resilient systems everywhere in the world, but also especially in the Global South, we really have to go back to the basics. it's not very sexy sometimes to say, you know, let's go to the basics. We all talk about technology and artificial intelligence is all overwhelming, you know. Countries don't have resources for that. The cost not only of the investment to acquire them, but actually to maintain them is quite high. And also the results by research show that technology has huge limitations. So what does going back mean in the sense of being resilient? First of all, means going back to we haven't achieved the basics in education, which is literacy. In Latin America, 8 out of 10 children at age 10 do not read or understand what they're reading. 8 out of 10. That means basically we've failed. I would say we've failed, and usually I say this, but then I say, well, we've come a long way. Well, we have come a long way. Here we have Becky, Yidan Prize, and she has worked in the region. She knows we've come a long way in terms of education. So it's not that everyone is failing. Not all states are failing. But if we see where we are now, we are still failing badly. So going back to the basics means basically let's create resilient systems that are able to at least deliver basic literacies, which again, it might sound like, oh, you know, it's very little, but 8 out of 10, we're not even doing that. And second, has to do, going back to the basics, has to do with going back to a humane education. And if we look at research again, what do systems that really improve do to improve? When we look at that, we see that the main issue is effective pedagogical practices. Those are feedback, metacognition, collaborative learning, etc. So, or mainly those. All that have to do with human interaction. You were saying about human interaction. So going back to the basics means in creating these resilient systems and very high quality systems is really investing in teachers and their capacity to do quite effective pedagogies. And it doesn't mean really going back to to start thinking about artificial intelligence. It means really training teachers how to do proper feedback, collaborative classes, etc., etc. Of course, artificial intelligence can help to that. But for many countries, that's really out of, these for this kind of meetings, you know? When you go into the field, it's out of the question. There's no internet, there's no electricity, etc. What are we talking about, really? So it might feel really nice and cool to talk about artificial intelligence in this kind of conferences, but when we go into the ground, that's very far away from reality, at least for Latin America. And we saw that during the 2 years in COVID. Most of the schools were closed, no internet, no nothing. The only thing we can do is to equip our teachers with pedagogical practices and focus especially on literacy. I'm not saying only or exclusively. I'm just saying let's go back to that. And then we can build resilience from there. So
we're almost out of time, but Becky, maybe just very briefly, one here, how can we balance urgent responses to emergencies and long-term development goals in education systems?
I think they're intertwined. And the development approach also has a significant impact on whether there are refugees or not, right? And whether they are able to return home or not as well. So I think looking at a state of urgency does mean, responding quickly, being able to make sure that there is somewhere safe for children to go, that there is some work on learning, and there's some work on preparing them to move into a national school. And that's all incredibly important. But making sure that we don't lose that connection and think that they're completely separate things. And I think you see this, this kind of cyclical resilience again. So you see, for example, a number of people working in the government in South Sudan went to school as refugees, and now they're in South Sudan, rebuilding their own country so that other people can return home.
Great. Okay. Well, Sultan, Becky, Javier, thank you very much indeed. Please.